The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, 1964, the Vietnam War. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, or the USS Maddox Incident, is the event responsible for America's entry into the Vietnam War. Vietnam was divided into halves, North and South, ruled by separate regimes, but the United States were concerned that Ho Chi Minh and the Communists would win the upcoming elections and were determined to stop the spread of communism. U.S. military involvement, however, had been minimal until 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson had been training South Vietnamese mercenaries, sending them into North Vietnam to carry out acts of sabotage and gather intel. On July 31, 1964, South Vietnamese commandos had attacked North Vietnamese targets in the Gulf of Tonkin. On August 2, 1964, American naval destroyers had moved into North Vietnam waters to gather intelligence on the enemy's naval strength. The USS Maddox was nearing the mouth of the river Delta when Captain Herrick noticed that they were being followed by North Vietnamese torpedo boats and had intercepted communications of their intention to attack, so he fired 3 warning shots. The USS Maddox was then fired upon by the enemy torpedo boats. Captain Herrick retaliated and opened fire on the torpedo boats, and with the assistance of U.S. jet fighters, hit all 3 enemy targets. The enemy boats had fired their torpedoes, but they all missed. The USS Maddox then retreated back into international waters. 2 days later, a second patrol was launched into the Gulf of Tonkin by the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, when Captain Herrick reported that they were again under attack. Secretary McNamara and President Johnson agreed that retaliation was needed and the expansion of the war was approved by Congress. However, Herrick sent a later message claiming that he was mistaken about the attack and that freak weather action may have led his men to overreact. The final part of the message read, "No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken." Nevertheless, this was ignored by Johnson and his advisors, who continued on with the retaliation plan. On August 5th, Johnson made a public speech stating, "The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage." Shortly after his speech, U.S. aircraft bombed North Vietnamese targets, torpedo boat bases, and an oil storage depot. America was now drawn into the Vietnam War. President Johnson made a speech via the media to the American people to get their support for the war and described the attack on 2 U.S. Navy warships as a deliberate aggression. By late 1965, 200,000 American troops were on the ground, with more on the way. What was superglue used for in the Vietnam War? Superglue is a cyanoacrylate, a fast-working adhesive. In the Vietnam War, U.S. troops used superglue to treat emergency wounds on the battlefield. In 1942, during World War II, a team of scientists, headed by Harry Coover Jr., were working for Eastman Kodak. As a part of the chemical division, they were designing a clear plastic for precision gun sights. The experiment was a failure, and the project was canceled as the chemicals had been very sticky, making them hard to work with. In 1951, Coover was again working with the chemical, this time with jet airplane canopies. Once again, the project was a failure because of the stickiness of the chemical. But these failures made Coover think of a new application for it. The super sticky cyanoacrylate could glue materials together with incredible strength and speed without the requirement of heat or pressure. Discovering a new adhesive by accident, he would name it Eastman 910, later named the more famous name of superglue. Dr. Coover demonstrated it on a show called I've Got a Secret in 1959, where he used a drop of the adhesive between 2 cylinders to lift the show's host, Gary Moore, off the ground. The idea for using the adhesive for medical purposes came quite early on, and Eastman submitted an application to the United States Food and Drug Administration for the use of the glue to hold human tissue together in surgery. After testing, the glue, while not yet approved for military use because of the potential toxicities to human tissue, was sent to the battlefields of Vietnam nevertheless. U.S. soldiers were issued the glue in the form of a spray bottle. In combat, field surgeons sprayed the adhesive on injured soldiers with open wounds to seal them shut to stop any bleeding as a temporary treatment. This lifesaver prevented many wounded soldiers bleeding out as they were transported back to base hospital for surgery. Coover would later reflect on his invention in the war. If somebody had a chest wound or open wound that was bleeding, the biggest problem they had was stopping the bleeding so they could get the patient back to the hospital. And the consequence was, many of them bled to death. So the medics used the spray, stopped the bleeding, and were able to get the wounded back to base hospital, and many, many lives were saved. Subscribe for more Vietnam War history videos. Get Simple History, the Vietnam War, and Simple History, the Cold War today. Tunnel Rats, the Vietnam War. The Communist forces began digging tunnel networks in South Vietnam in the late 1940s during the First Indochina War against French colonial rule. By the Vietnam War in the 1960s, the tunnels had evolved into a complex system with hospitals, storage, kitchens, and headquarters. The NVA and Viet Cong went underground into the Cu Chi tunnels when the U.S. forces bombed the area. As well as providing shelter, these tunnels helped the NVA and Viet Cong launch sneak attacks and ambushes, as well as lay booby traps close to enemy positions. To clear out these dangerous tunnels, brave infantrymen from Australia, New Zealand, South Vietnam, and the United States volunteered for this unenviable job. They would gain the nickname Tunnel Rats. The soldiers chosen were usually short, at 5'6" and under, as they could fit in the claustrophobic conditions. Initially, dogs had been used. However, this did not work as they could not detect booby traps. Grenades or tear gas could also be used to flush out the tunnels. However, this could alert the enemy or destroy intelligence. The tunnel rat would be lowered down head first by his fellow soldiers and have to stealthily move around in the darkness, navigating the dark tunnels armed only with an M1911A1 pistol, a flashlight, and a knife. He would listen for any enemy movements, followed by a second man who would radio to the surface to map the tunnels. The M1911A1 pistol and its large .45 caliber round caused a blinding muzzle flash and a noise in the confined space, which could temporarily cause deafness, so tunnel rats would improvise their own suppressors or use a civilian revolver sent from home. As part of these search and destroy missions, the tunnel rats would search for enemy intelligence and place C4 charges on weak points so the tunnel could be later destroyed. Inside, they could encounter booby traps, such as punji sticks or released snakes and scorpions, before they even found any enemies. Poison gas was also found in these tunnels, but tunnel rats often risked not wearing a gas mask as they restricted vision, hearing, and breathing. If they encountered the NVA or Viet Cong, the tunnel rats were instructed not to fire 5 to 6 shots in a row, as it would tell the enemy that they were about to reload. Overall, the job of the tunnel rat was stressful and terrifying, and could see a man's nerves break in what was one of the most dangerous jobs of the war. What was fragging? The Vietnam War. As the Vietnam War became more controversial and morale dipped, a disturbing new phenomenon emerged in the U.S. military called fragging. Fragging would see soldiers turn on authority figures, murdering their superior officer, or NCO. Although it wasn't always the case, the term fragging came about because these intentional killings were often attempted with a fragmentation grenade. The grenade would be thrown at the officer when he was sleeping or during combat, therefore making it appear as an accident or as a casualty during an engagement with the enemy. On top of this, as a grenade detonates, the evidence is destroyed. The disgruntled soldiers who carried out fraggings were often in support units rather than combat units. Their motives for carrying out this crime would vary. One motive was the level of discipline or harassment by the officer upon the subordinate. It was difficult to instill discipline when officers were rotated every 6 months between units, forming little connection to them. Respect for officers could also be tarnished by racial tensions and the popular youth culture of challenging authority figures. Another motive might have been the risk to the soldier's life. Their officer may be too incompetent, or on the other end, searching for glory and gung-ho, employing dangerous tactics at the expense of men under his command so that he can achieve medals and praise. Drug and alcohol use may also be a motive, and problems were often caused when officers tried to intervene in their men's use of narcotics, something that was easy to obtain in Vietnam. If caught fragging their officer, perpetrators would be court-martialed and often charged with a life sentence. Although fragging had been apparent in past wars in the U.S. military, it was rare until the Vietnam War, where there were hundreds of cases reported.
A need for more manpower upon America's deeper involvement in the Vietnam War in 1965 made President Johnson bring in conscription. Now young men, who were not considering military service, would consider whether they might get picked to fight in the Vietnam conflict across the globe. While 2/3 of Americans volunteered during the Vietnam War, the other third would be drafted. All males aged 18 to 26 were required to register for the draft. The names of American men of draft age were recorded by the Selective Service System. When called out by the local draft board, which was often composed of veterans, he would be evaluated on whether he would be drafted in the military or not. The local board's decisions were often seen as unfair. Most of the men chosen were from poor and working class backgrounds, people of color, and people from rural towns and farming communities. Draft boards would frequently defer middle-class men, who they would see as having valuable futures, and the upper classes were barely drafted at all. There were many ways in which draftees could be deferred or exempt from the draft. For example, men who were medically unfit, men who were married with children, or students at college. Men who had held college deferments were eligible for induction until age 35, but as few men between the ages of 26 and 35 were ever drafted. They could maintain a college deferment until their 26th birthday and avoid service altogether. Some draft resistors could be put in jail for refusing to fight in the war. They broke the law by escaping the draft, by refusing to turn up to the local board or fleeing to Canada. Those who were opposed to the draft became known as draft dodgers. When the war started, they were seen as cowards, but as the war dragged on and opposition to the draft grew, public attitude was more sympathetic. The draft process changed in late 1969 to make it fairer as a result of the public discontent. A draft lottery was created where 366 blue plastic capsules, each containing a birth date in the year, were dumped into a large glass container. The capsules were then drawn out, opened, and announced one by one, nervously watched on national television by young men born from 1944 to 1950. The first date announced was September 14th. So all registrants with that birthday were assigned lottery number 1. Men with lower numbers were called first and had to report to induction centers where they could be sent to the Vietnam War. The fourth and final lottery drawing was held on February 2nd, 1972, and those announced who would have been called to induction in 1973. However, President Nixon shifted to an all-volunteer force, ending the draft in the Vietnam War.
Operation Rolling Thunder, March 2nd, 1965 through November 2nd, 1968. The Vietnam War. Operation Rolling Thunder was one of the most intense aerial campaigns in U.S. history. As the largest U.S. Air Force operation of the Vietnam War, it lasted from March 2nd, 1965 until November 2nd, 1968. Originally, the operation was not the idea of the military, but it was the brainchild of President Lyndon B. Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara. Their idea was to use military force as a way to apply pressure against the North Vietnamese government that was helping communist insurgents known as the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. The reason why President Johnson's administration decided to use aerial bombing rather than a land invasion was because of the fear that ground intervention would take many American lives and could lead to the involvement of China and the Soviet Union into the conflict. The task of the campaign was to 1. Boost the morale of the South Vietnamese people and the Saigon government, since they were having problems fighting insurgents. 2. Persuade the North Vietnamese government to stop supporting insurgents in the South. 3. To destroy the North Vietnamese industrial infrastructure and transport communications between North and South Vietnam. And 4. To prevent the influx of soldiers and material from the North to the South. Operation Rolling Thunder was carried out by the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy under the Pacific Command, but it was strictly controlled by the President's civilian administration. The strikes were initially conducted by the 2nd Division of the United States Air Force, but as of April 1966, bombing raids were conducted by the 7th Air Force of the USAF. Most United States Air Force strikes were conducted from bases in Thailand, while the Navy used aircraft carriers of the 7th Fleet, Task Force 77, from the Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin. The U.S. Air Force and Navy operated on completely different principles, which on many occasions led to interference in the air over North Vietnam. To prevent larger incidents from December 1965, the Pacific Command divided operational zones into 7 route packages. The U.S. Air Force had route packs 1, 5, and 6A, while the U.S. Navy had Route Packs 2, 3, 4, and 6B. The border with China was put under the buffer zone, and the city of Hanoi and Haiphong were also marked as prohibited areas. Although all kinds of aircraft were used in the operation, it was the F-105 Thunder Chief that took most of the combat, with more than 75% of all the United States Air Force sorties. On their missions, Thunder Chiefs were carrying either 5 1,000-pound or 6 750-pound bombs. Flying from bases in Thailand, they had to be refueled in the air over Laos. Although the F-105 proved itself in combat, they had a large casualty rate with almost half of the fleet destroyed after Operation Rolling Thunder was over. The Air Force then introduced the F-4 Phantom as a much better match for the North Vietnamese MiGs with its radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrow air-to-air missiles. Soon, the F-4 would completely replace the F-105 in Vietnam War missions. The biggest drawback of these aircraft was that they were limited by bad weather, which was a big problem during the rainy seasons. This could have been overcome with B-52 bombers, which were allowed for use only a few miles north of the demilitarized zone. The U.S. Navy also used a variety of aircraft during the campaign. At the beginning, Task Force 77 relied on old Douglas A-1 Sky Raiders, a propeller plane that was capable of carrying heavy bomb loads. As it proved to be very vulnerable to sophisticated North Vietnamese air defenses, it was replaced with the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk. The A-4 Skyhawk was for the Navy what the F-105 was to the Air Force. It carried out most of the sorties over the Navy route packs, but also suffered heavy losses. By the end of the operation, 1/3 of the entire fleet was shot down. As the operation escalated, another aircraft entered the fight. The Grumman A-6A Intruder was the first aircraft designed to strike targets at night or in bad weather. It was equipped with a digital integrated attack system which allowed the pilot to execute the mission without having visual references. As a defensive measure against U.S. aircraft, the North Vietnamese deployed a complete arsenal of anti-aircraft defenses, from AA artillery to surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs. The main threat to U.S. planes over North Vietnam were Soviet SA-2 missiles, or the S-75 Dvina, famous for shooting down the U-2 spy plane. In 1965, the Soviets deployed thousands of missiles, launchers, and radars to North Vietnam. Once set up, they posed a significant threat to American planes flying at high altitudes. Frustratingly, the U.S. civilian administration forbade attacking SAM launching sites unless attacked by one. They feared that striking them would lead to the death of Soviet instructors, which would then have greater consequences. The North Vietnamese, however, had no restraints in using their SA-2 systems against U.S. aircraft, which forced U.S. airmen to develop proper countermeasures. The U.S. Air Force and Navy countered them in two ways. One was using aircraft equipped with electronic devices for jamming enemy radars. Another method was to use the Wild Weasel F-105G aircraft equipped to locate and destroy SAM radars. Suppressing the SAMs was organized as an entire sub-operation called Operation Iron Hand. Those SAMs were credited with shooting down 101 enemy aircraft. Their effectiveness was largely diminished by these U.S. countermeasures. From a 5.7% effectiveness in 1965, it dropped to 0.9% by 1968. Another threat that the U.S. aircraft had to deal with was the North Vietnamese Air Force. Their main aircraft was the MiG-17, which at the time was becoming obsolete, but it served its purpose very well. A much bigger threat were the MiG-21s, which were a good match for the F-4 with their AA-2 Atoll Vimpel K-13 air-to-air missiles. Another frustration for American pilots was that the North Vietnamese managed to build new airfields for their aircraft. A proper response against them from the American side was forbidden due to the ban on such strikes from the chain of command. Although far less sophisticated, AA guns proved to be the main threat to U.S. aircraft, with 5,795 guns deployed. Their fire shot down the majority of all U.S. planes. The main reason for this was that the U.S. aircraft were mostly flying on low altitudes to evade SAM radars. Rolling Thunder was approved by the President on February 13, 1965, and the first strike was made on March 2nd on a small ammunition depot near the border. At the beginning, it was obvious that the operation was far behind military expectations, as the command failed to reach immediate superiority over the enemy forces because they were stalling and picking targets of low importance. During the entire operation, the rolling strategy was going too slow to make a significant impact on the tides of war. One reason why the operation had never reached its full military potential was that the American civilian administration, far away from the action, applied many limitations and saw the operation as just applying political pressure against North Vietnam. On several occasions, the president paused the entire operation in order to check the readiness of North Vietnam to negotiate. Since the North Vietnamese never had the intention of doing so, they used this period of time to recover from previous strikes. The administration was in constant fear of provoking China and the Soviet Union into entering the conflict, so they imposed a variety of target restrictions. This hampered the efforts of the military. During the 3.5 years of the campaign, it didn't reach its political or military goals, and Rolling Thunder became a burden for Johnson's administration. Both Johnson and McNamara, while the creators of the operation, would become their opponents. On March 31, 1968, President Johnson ordered a partial pause in the bombing campaign, which led to a complete halt on November 1st, therefore ending Operation Rolling Thunder. In the end, Operation Rolling Thunder proved to be a failure, not because of the air power incompetence, but due to the strategy of gradualism and the restrictive controls of the civilian administration. Viet Cong guerrilla, the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong were the evolution of the communist Viet Minh guerrillas during the First Indochina War against the French. The country split into the communist-ruled North and the U.S.-backed South under Ngo Dinh Diem. As it became apparent, Diem's government was unpopular. The North Vietnamese government sent former Viet Minh guerrillas to the south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to aid the struggle for a unified communist Vietnam. These cadres made contact with villagers and talked to the locals in order to gain support for their cause. In 1960, the National Liberation Front, set up as a part of the political arm of the guerrilla movement, calling for the Southern Vietnamese to overthrow the camouflage colonial regime of the American imperialists. These cadres recruited guerrilla soldiers from support of local people they found, or in some cases, recruited at gunpoint. The main full-time guerrillas were trained at bases, ready for full-scale combat, while the part-time guerrillas would remain in the villages as militia with basic training. They would provide intel and set booby traps around the perimeter. The Viet Cong guerrilla wore a floppy jungle hat, rubber sandals, and a tunic. Some of the weapons they used were the Soviet SKS carbine semi-automatic rifle, the Soviet 7.62mm AK-47 assault rifle, or its Chinese copy, the Type 56 assault rifle, RPGs, grenades, landmines, and other booby traps. The Viet Cong would raid villages and eliminate government-appointed village leaders. They would ambush the enemy on roads and launch attacks on U.S. military advisors. When the United States sent in its armed forces to prevent the fall of South Vietnam to communist forces, it found the Viet Cong to be a difficult foe. The Viet Cong carried out ambushes and laid booby traps while engaging in close combat firefights to prevent the use of air support by U.S. forces. The Viet Cong guerrilla, meanwhile, in addition to combat with U.S. ground forces, had to endure bombing, napalm, and heavy armed enemy aircraft and helicopters. They also had to endure poisonous reptiles and malaria as well as starvation. Many Viet Cong would hide from the enemy in tunnels which contained kitchens, a hospital, and sleeping quarters. During the Tet Offensive in 1968, the Viet Cong took advantage of the fact that South Vietnamese soldiers would be on leave, concealing themselves among civilians returning home. They occupied cities across South Vietnam, even occupying the capital, Saigon, and demoralizing American morale to continue in the war. U.S. infantry weapons, the Vietnam War. The U.S. forces used a range of small arms in the Vietnam War. Let's have a look at some of the common weapons used by American troops. The M14 rifle. This was the standard-issue rifle of the U.S. infantrymen until 1967 through 68, when it was replaced with the M16. It was effectively a replacement for the M1 Garand, the BAR, the M1 carbine, the M3 grease gun, and the Thompson, which were still being used in the Vietnam War. The M14 had a 20-round detachable box magazine, which held the powerful 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge and could fire in semi-automatic or fully automatic mode, although this was hard to control. The M16A1 rifle. The M16A1 became the standard U.S. Army rifle in 1969, replacing the M14. The M16A1 itself was an upgrade of the M16, which was first being used by the U.S. Air Force and then limited use with the U.S. Army, gaining a reputation for jamming. The M16A1 fixed reliability issues via a forward assist and chrome-lined barrel. It was gas-operated and could fire in semi-automatic and fully automatic modes. The rifle was fed via 20 or 30-round detachable box magazines, holding the smaller 5.56 by 45mm NATO caliber. The M60 machine gun. This primary general-purpose machine gun could be used as both a squad support or a vehicle-mounted weapon. The weapon could even be fired somewhat accurately from the shoulder without the bipod in place. The M60 fired the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge held on a belt. These cartridge belts were heavy and therefore were often spread across the infantry squad members. The M79 grenade launcher. This grenade launcher, known as the blooper or the thumper, could fire high explosive and smoke grenades. The M79 launcher gave the option of having a grenadier in the squad. Although it was a primary weapon, it made him vulnerable at close quarters. The M1911A1 pistol. As it was in previous wars, the M1911A1 continued to see service in Vietnam as the standard sidearm in the U.S. Army. Model 77E shotgun. The Stevens M77E was the most manufactured and used shotgun during the conflict used by the Army and Marines. It was pump action and had a shorter stock with a rubber recoil pad to make it easier for South Vietnamese soldiers to use the weapon. The M7 bayonet. This bayonet was designed to be used with the M16 rifle and was based on the older M6 bayonet for the M14 rifle. The M61 or M67 grenade. The M61 grenade was a variant of the M26, featuring a jungle clip to prevent snagging on vegetation, therefore preventing accidental detonation. It contained 5.5 ounces of explosives and resembled a lemon. It was replaced by the spherical M67 grenade near the end of the war. The M18 Claymore mine. This anti-personnel mine was contained in a plastic box that, when detonated, fired metal balls outward like a shotgun. It could be used on infantry and even some vehicles.